Good morning. Thank you very much for joining me for this webinar. As you can see on the first slide here, my name's Tom Selby. I'm a senior analyst at AJ Bell. Today, something probably a little bit different to what you usually get in these things. I'm going to talk about the media, about journalism, the kind of personal finance stories that journalists are likely to write in the next 12 months, and cover off a few public policy issues as well. Before I crack on, a couple of things about me. So I've been at AJ Bell for just over 2 years. I'm our main spokesperson on pensions and retirement issues. Prior to joining AJ Bell, I was a journalist for just over 6 years for a magazine called Money Marketing, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a financial magazine for financial advisors. So I covered pensions there for my first 4 years or so. Latterly was the head of news there. So hoping to combine some of the things that I've learned in those two roles in order to give you a bit of information about the media and why they write the stories that they do. Just the usual risk warnings there, just while you're quickly reading those. I should say that questions to me can be put in the box on your screen. So first of all, I'm going to look at the Daily Express as a brief case study, a newspaper that covers pensions probably more towards the front of certainly of the hard copy of the paper than any other publication. We'll then go inside the mind of a journalist, potentially a dangerous place, to look at the things that the journalists think about when they're writing a story and the pressures that they face. And then we'll put some of those things together to look at the 2018-19 news agenda. So some of the public policy things that will be pushed towards journalists and will make them write the things that they are going to write in the next 12 months. So if we kick off with the case study, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Daily Express, still a fairly popular newspaper, although obviously suffering a decline, certainly in its hard paper sales like most others. Circulation around 364,000. Interestingly, I didn't realise this, that's more than the FT, more than the Observer, more than the Guardian, only just below the Daily Telegraph. So still a reasonably well-read newspaper in the UK. I picked the Express because it has a penchant to write about pensions probably more than anyone else, particularly on its front page. The main reason for that is its demographic is older, and so pensions tend to affect their lives. Interestingly, actually, today, quite handily, the front page is a campaign from the Express for the government to introduce a cabinet minister for the elderly. Obviously shows just how seriously they take pensions issues, and perhaps also the fact that it's a bit of a slow news day. So just on this side, if you look on the left-hand side here, we've got some headlines from the Daily Express for the year from March 2017, so a 12-month period. These are headlines that appeared on the front page of the newspaper containing the word pensions. I found this quite incredible, actually. So over a 12-month period, you had 11 front page headlines, so about one every 5 weeks containing the word pensions. If you stop and just think about that for a second, think about the things that have happened over during that 12-month period. You've got the Brexit negotiations going on. You've got Donald Trump in America, potential a renewed Cold War with Russia potentially. You've got issues involving North Korea. A royal wedding, of course, has just been and gone. I'm sure everyone's read about that. And pensions still featured on the front page of the Express no fewer than 11 times. Now, in terms of the way that those stories were covered, the block in red shows negative news stories, and the lone green block there towards the bottom, pensions boost for millions, shows the single positive story. So in terms of the stuff that clients are going to be reading from the Daily Express, you can see that it's primarily going to be negative. Now, quite interesting actually to pick a few of the headlines here just to see the way that they approach pensions. Clearly it's mainly a negative bent, but you can see there's no fewer than 3 tax raids on pensions over that 12-month period. So one of those tax raids was simply people not being aware that 3/4 of their pensions were taxed as income. I think that was a survey by a different provider. One of them was the issue of overtaxation of pension freedoms withdrawals, so the month one issue, which is something that we've talked about previously. And the third one was around rumours that the Chancellor was going to take the axe to pensions tax relief. That's something we'll pick up on later. Eventually, it didn't happen, but there were significant rumours around that ahead of the last budget. Also, you'll see towards the bottom there something that's quite familiar to anyone who's a reader of the Express or looks at their headlines. You've got in January 2018, pensions crisis for millions, and a month later, pensions boost for millions. The crisis there, if you're interested, people aren't saving enough for retirement. That was just a bit of research, I think, from the Prudential. Pension boost for millions, final salary deficits down. So if you're anything like me, then you probably take some issue with the fact that those are news stories. But for the Express, the key is to get pensions on the front page. In terms of something interesting, actually, that I was told recently by a former Express hack, unverified, but when the Express puts the word pension on the front page, increases the amount of copies they sell by about 20%. So you can start to realise exactly why it is they focus in on pensions as an issue for their front page. In terms of the broad spectrum of coverage, you'll roughly see 2 negative stories for every 1 positive story in the Express, and clearly that kind of stuff feeds down into people's perception of pensions, the clients' perceptions of pensions as well, and potentially the kind of questions that they will ask. So here again, just emphasising that point, this graph shows the net level of negative of stories in terms of whether they're positive or negative from the Express. That's from January 2010. We can see in the mid part there was a brief spell where the trend was slightly upwards, but generally the trend is downwards. So people are reading things about pensions that say that they aren't working, that they potentially aren't a good investment, and that is one of the many reasons why you see negativity around pensions and retirement issues generally. Now delving inside the mind of a journalist. So one of the most common questions I was asked both when I was a journalist and today in my current job was, why are journalists so negative? So we saw on the previous slide the Express taking almost entirely negative approach to pensions news on its front page. And I'm always reminded of a quote from one of my favourite TV shows, Peep Show, where Nancy, Jez's girlfriend, asks why don't they talk about all the buses that made it safely when they're watching a news broadcast of a bus crash. And Mark rather sarcastically responds, yes, I suppose the news should just be a dispassionate list of all the events that have occurred the world over that day. That'd be good, except it would take forever. Slightly facetious, but also in the main, that is true. So journalists, and I think the wider public in general, expect the financial services industry, just as they expect buses and trains and all the rest of it, to do their job. So stories such as provider or advisor does a good job for their clients, assets hit X billion, which was a particular bugbear of mine when I was a journalist, when providers would come to me and say their assets had reached a set round figure, I'd always think, so what? Transfer times down, things like that. They are the equivalent to the on-time bus for journalists, and I think it's fair to say for their readers as well. So good news stories, not impossible if you look at some of the headlines generated around automatic enrolment, for example. There have been some good news stories there in terms of opt-outs being low, although we'll have to wait and see as to whether or not that continues, contributions ratchet up. But positive news stories are always likely to play second fiddle to negative stories, so stories involving scandal, cock-up, tax rage, shock, etc. They're the things that sell papers, and in my experience as we move to an online world as well, they're the stories that generate clicks, and the clicks that advertisers and magazines need to survive. One other point that we can't forget is there's a history of bad stuff that continues to weigh on pensions and the retirement sector. You only have to think of things like Equitable Life, Robert Maxwell in the Mirror, personal pensions mis-selling, and more recently issues around annuities as well. As we move forward, some of those issues which I'll talk about towards the end around defined benefit pension transfers, and also potentially the pension freedoms as well. There'll be questions around whether those are going to be the next mis-selling scandal, the scandal of the future that we'll look back on and see negative headlines around. Just in terms of the pressures on journalists, so I spoke to several of my old colleagues and just tried to get a feel for the kind of things that they worry about and that affect the way that they cover news. So briefly, if we just go through these, so deadlines. So this is certainly one that would have affected me back in the day. If you've got an immediate deadline, so quite often journalists will have to nowadays, especially in an online world, produce stories within a matter of minutes. It'll be a question of doing the top line of a press release, and there'll be a lot of pressure on that, and there'll be a lot of pressure also to get the headline as strong as possible. If you've got a little bit longer, you can be more considered, you can get into the real guts of a story. You're still going to get a strong headline there, but you're going to get hopefully something that reflects the skills and the abilities of that journalist better than somebody who's having to turn around a results press release in a matter of minutes. In terms of the article type, so you'll have features and analysis, which might take a different tone to a hard news piece. You also look at things like online versus print, as I mentioned earlier. That's driving up the pressure on journalists in terms of the deadlines they've got and in terms of the time that they can spend to really understand the different subjects that they're writing about. Political leaning, always an important one. So if you're writing for the Daily Telegraph or the Mail, for example, there'll be a stronger personal finance focus generally, actually, because their audience, by and large, tend to be more right-wing and tend to be wealthier, whereas if you look at something like The Guardian, it barely covers financial services issues at all. In terms of prominence, so in the bottom right there's a couple of things to think here. So if you're there'll be times when a journalist is writing a story or is handed a story and they think it's going to place fairly low down in the paper, and then it gets ramped up, so it gets bumped up to a higher place in the paper, and there'll be pressure from the editor there on the left and other members of the editorial team to push the story as hard as possible. And sometimes journalists will find themselves pushed to a point where actually they probably feel quite uncomfortable with where the story's gone and how aggressive it is versus what they might have pitched to their editor at the time. So that's something that can often be out of a journalist's control. Prominence will also impact on the stories you chase. So journalists tend to be quite ambitious people, and there's a lot of competition in terms of getting your stuff on the front page. So you'll tend to chase stories that you know are likely to be appealing to your editor and appealing to the boss of the newspaper, so you can get away from perhaps just the money section and up towards the front page of the newspaper. Audience linked to a couple of the other ones. So journalists are clearly writing for their demographic as well as for their editors. So again, if you think of something like the Telegraph, more likely to write about issues that might affect advisors' clients, like the annual allowance taper. Think about something like the Mirror, that's likely to be less of an issue there, more likely to focus on stuff like the state pension and automatic enrolment, which will more likely affect their readership. Just in terms of what makes a good story, so there are clearly many things that can go into a story that works and that is going to be read by lots of people. I think in terms of this slide, the most important, I would say, is impact. So that's one of the reasons actually why pensions tend to feature fairly prominently. Most people have got them increasingly through automatic enrolment, and the sums involved tend to be huge for a lot of people. A pension will be the biggest asset that they own, even including their house. It'll certainly be among the top two. In terms of controversy, so if you can get something that divides opinion, so you've got two different sides who are battling over it, then potentially that will make a more interesting story as you get into the content. Something that's radical, again, if it's something that divides opinion, it tends to be radical. It'll tend to be something that generates interest, and you can also have a story then that runs and runs, which again is dynamite for a journalist. You really want to have a story that's not just a one-off, but that can give you lots and lots of content. And then finally, and it might sound obvious, but new as well, a lot of the stories that I've seen since I first started in journalism back in 2009 are a regurgitation of the debates that happened 2 or 3 years ago. So if you can get something that's genuinely new and exciting, then you've got yourself a story that readers will be interested in, and hopefully your editor will be interested in as well. So bringing that all together, I picked out 3 issues, 3 stories that I think clients and the rest of us will be reading about in 2018-19. I've focused these on personal finance issues. So if we kick off with, and I feel like I have to apologise for this, it's an old one, pension tax relief reform. Unfortunately, it's an issue that I don't think is going to go away. So if you look in the top left of your screen there, you'll see a gentleman called Matthew Taylor. He is a senior figure within the Royal Society of Arts. He also reviewed the self-employed market for the government and was a former advisor to Tony Blair, so a reasonably influential individual. He recently produced a report for the RSA, which ostensibly was looking again at the issue of self-employed, but the central argument within that report was to introduce a flat rate of pension tax relief at 30%. If we look to the right of Matthew Taylor, perhaps a more familiar figure, Lord Willits, who chairs the Intergenerational Commission. You probably heard or read about the report that was produced by that commission looking to bridge the divide between the generation coming up, often referred to as millennials, and older people who they argue tend to have done better out of society in general. In order to bridge that gap, the commission recommended a whole heap of things. The most controversial probably being handing £10,000 to over 25s to spend on a limited number of things, so to save in a pension, to reduce debt or student debt, or to pay towards a first home. Also talked about reducing the IHT allowance significantly to pay for that. More controversially, I think levying national insurance on the incomes of people over state pension age, and of course introducing a flat rate of pensions tax relief. So we've got 2 reports there from 2 fairly senior people close to the government, close to the Treasury, calling for broadly the same thing. Now in the bottom right, we've got former Chancellor, now newspaper editor, George Osborne, who kicked all this debate off, I guess, certainly in the modern era, in 2015 with his paper Strengthening the Incentive to Save, which looked at the issues around reforming pensions tax relief. You might remember it looked at potentially introducing a pensions ISA, so flipping the system on its head. So withdrawals were tax-free, but payments in were taxed. That never got anywhere, primarily, I think, because the EU referendum happened. It didn't go the way that he wanted. And as a result, any plans around that were shelved. The important thing to say is that the work has been done by the Treasury. There are clearly people within the Treasury who want to do this, but the question is whether or not they can do it in the current environment. So then we get to the key figure in the bottom left. That's Philip Hammond, who faces a lot of tough choices, especially around the NHS and funding for long-term care as well. He hasn't got a lot of money to deal with those issues. So the question that he faces is, how does he find that money? Now, as always, pensions tax relief will be somewhere near the top of the Treasury's thinking in terms of raising money, whether or not he feels he has the political capital to go for something as radical as a flat rate, which would clearly hurt core voters, anyone who's a higher or additional rate taxpayer, assuming that they went for a level of around 30%. Incidentally, I think the real danger with this is that, so it's suggested that around 30% is the level that needs to be introduced in order for it to be fiscally neutral. I think Philip Hammond would want to raise money by doing this. So if they went down this route, and I think it's highly unlikely that they will, then he would potentially go for a much lower rate. So it would be hitting certainly the vast majority of advised clients a lot harder than the two guys at the top of the slide suggest it should. Even though it's unlikely this will happen for a variety of reasons, that won't stop the speculation. And when you've got serious think tanks with serious heavyweights at the top like these two, then it's likely that it's going to remain in the news, and the rumour mill will inevitably start churning as we build up to the budget. Now, in terms of why this would be a story, why it would be something that journalists would be interested in, well, impact, yes, clearly. Anyone who saves into a pension at the moment, a flat rate of 28% or 30% was introduced, would be affected either in a negative or positive way, depending on which income tax band they fall into. In terms of the impact it could have fiscally, a net 25 billion a year roughly is spent on pension tax relief and rising through auto enrolment. So that's one of the reasons why this is inevitably going to come back on the agenda again. Divides opinion clearly among the industry. Certainly, some people favour radical reform of pension tax relief. Some people are against it. People like me tend to be reasonably neutral, although I've still yet to see anyone clearly explain exactly how a flat rate pensions tax relief would work for defined benefit pension schemes. I think the key in all of this is if the government is going to do anything on pensions tax relief, then they need to consult widely, they need to do it for the long term, and they need to make sure that they don't damage the savings culture that's slowly being built in the UK. Radical, if it happens, then yes, it would be incredibly radical. A flat rate of pension tax relief would completely change the incentive structure of retirement saving in the UK. And new, to a lot of people listening to this, it probably isn't that new as an issue. To a lot of journalists and certainly to a lot of the wider public, this will be new. In fact, a lot of the wider public will have no idea whatsoever about how their pensions are incentivised in the first place. So in terms of what questions could clients ask on the back of stories around pension tax relief, the obvious one, will pension tax relief be cut? Clearly the answer to that is we don't know at the moment, but as from what we know, there are no plans, but we've no idea what could be said in a future budget. Is a tax-free lump sum safe? Miss a word there, some. But I think that I would be stunned if the government took away the tax-free lump sum. It's one of the few things about retirement saving that people really understand and like. It would be incredibly risky for a Conservative government, given that it's got a wafer-thin majority in the House of Commons. Should I pay more in now? So as you build up to the budget, we often get this. So you'll get the rumour mills going round. There'll be stories on the front page of newspapers suggesting that higher rate tax relief is for the chop. There'll probably be some of these think tanks and others putting their ideas to journalists, which will be pushed forward as potential government policy. I always think the best thing to do is to not react to this stuff. Clearly, clients should save as much in a tax incentivized environment as possible, but reacting and trying to second guess what politicians are going to do is a bit of a fool's game. And is a pension still the right vehicle to save in? So if you start to worry about whether savings incentives are going to be cut back in a pension, then should you consider saving in something else? Next on the list, reining in the pension freedom. So this has been coming for a while. So 4 years on from, just over 4 years on from George Osborne's shock announcement at the 2014 budget that the UK's retirement framework was going to be completely overhauled. We're still seeing regulation in the form of the Financial Conduct Authority in the top right corner there, catching up with the way that the market works. Last year, the FCA published its Retirement Outcomes Review interim report, which looked at the pension freedoms and the behaviour of consumers and their understanding of the decisions that they're making. Now, one of the headline findings was they found no clear evidence that savers are squandering their pensions. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody's making bad decisions. I think what it more means is that the regulator doesn't have the data it would need, so knowing about all the different defined benefit pensions people have, housing wealth, all the rest of it, to know whether the withdrawal patterns that they've seen suggest people are making withdrawals at an unsustainable rate. The vast majority of total withdrawals, so people taking out their entire pension pot, were among small pots, so those worth £30,000 or less, which doesn't point to a huge problem. And actually, one of the issues that was raised in that report, which is I think is going to lead the news agenda this year, certainly among the trade press and in the money sections as well, was around the issue of reckless conservatism. So we saw that in Australia, which has adopted a system vaguely akin to that system we've got now, where people are free to spend their money, and actually people were paralysed by fear and so didn't take out enough money in retirement, and as a result they didn't enjoy the lifestyles that they could have enjoyed if they took out slightly more money. Some of these concerns were backed up by research that AJ Bell did, and this is non-advised consumers, which pointed to an engagement gap among non-advised customers. So we've seen a significant minority of people withdrawing money out of pensions and putting it straight into a bank account that might be paying zero interest, or into another investment product, which might not necessarily be the right decision, particularly if you're paying tax on those withdrawals. We've also seen, worryingly, people entering drawdown simply to get their hands on their tax-free cash without knowing anything about the way that their money's invested or having any particular plan for the final 75% of their money. Now, it's on this bit that I'm going to focus now. So again, if we look around the board here, the thing that these people have got in common, so we've got Frank Field in the top left, the chair of the Work and Pensions Committee, and then again Matthew Taylor, bottom right, from the RSA, and David Willits from the Resolution Foundation. They've all backed this idea of retirement pathways, which was raised in the FCA's interim retirement outcomes review report. So what the FCA meant by retirement pathways was non-advised providers to provide default investments for people who move into drawdown, and those providers would likely be required to ask a series of questions in order to get an idea of how people plan to withdraw their money and their appetite for risk and all the rest of it, and then would likely present them with a series of funds, and the customer would have to decide whether or not they wanted to take those funds, which you would assume they would be opted into given that it's a pathway, or whether they wanted to opt out and stick with their investment strategy. Now, that idea has been backed by all three of these organisations to various degrees, although certainly the Matthew Taylor would prefer to see not just default investments, but also defaulting into drawdown and at a set withdrawal rate as well, which I think is potentially incredibly difficult when people's circumstances are likely to change. The one thing we haven't had from anyone on this, which we will hopefully get if the FCA goes down this route, is details on the practicalities of making it work. So how many funds would providers have to offer? What questions would they need to ask? How would they ask those questions without straying into the advice process? And crucially, how would people opt out of the default fund? Because clearly you don't want people accidentally being opted into a default fund that they didn't want, and then potentially having to pay a load of money to sell their existing investments in order to buy a default fund that they never wanted in the first place. As a side note, one of my frustrations around the way that think tanks and the Work and Pensions Committee work is that often they'll propose something, in this case based on a line listed in the FCA report, without really thinking about how this stuff's going to work in practice. I in fact spent a bit of time speaking to some researchers from Frank Field's team, and they weren't clear exactly what it was they were proposing initially. It took them a while to come back to me to confirm it was along the lines of the default investment pathway, but in the report all they said was default retirement pathways, without saying exactly what that meant and whether it affected withdrawal levels or not. So in terms of why this is going to be a story this year, well, Impact, most certainly. So we've seen since the launch of the pension freedoms, almost 1 million people have withdrawn £17.5 billion have withdrawn £17.5 billion flexibly from their pensions since April 2015. The majority of those would have done that on a non-advised basis, and if the FCA goes down this route, which I have a suspicion they may do given the pressure that's on them, then it will have implications for the way that they experience the pension freedoms if they're moving into drawdown. Definitely divides opinion. I think people across the industry are concerned about the idea of trying to repeat what's worked in automatic enrolment in the drawdown space, where clearly engagement is absolutely crucial. Radical, yep, you bet it is. I mean, this is regulating the pension freedoms. All of this stuff is new at the moment, and certainly the UK as a market has never never dealt with the idea of defaulting people into drawdown strategies. And new, again, because this is the pension freedoms and reacting to the pension freedoms, all this stuff is brand new. The kind of questions clients could ask if this stuff gets written about: is my money invested appropriately? So clearly, if there are stories around people not reviewing their investment decisions, then a client might come to you and ask how their money is invested and whether it meets their withdrawal strategy and their appetite for risk, which you would hope it is. Crucially, am I withdrawing the right amount? So am I withdrawing too much or too little based on my age and based on the amount of risk I've got in my portfolio? What happens if markets go south? So-called pound cost ravaging. This is something that has been written about significantly in the trade press, but not too much in the national press to date. But I suspect if there are lots of people who are taking a lot of risk in their drawdown portfolios and are making significant withdrawals at the same time, then if we do get a market dip, and let's face it, we are overdue one, then those stories will start to creep out of the woodwork. Finally, back in 2009, when I started writing about pensions for a small pensions magazine, defined benefit closures seemed to be we seem to be coming towards an end of the defined benefit tail. I must have written the phrase "final nail in the DB coffin" a good 10 times. I didn't think we'd get forward to 2018 and this would be at the top of the news agenda, but it is. And one of the primary reasons for that is the man at the bottom right of your screen there, Sir Philip Green. I made sure I picked the most flattering picture of Sir Philip that I could find there. So we had Philip Green, clearly, who was in charge of BHS and then sold the company for a quid and was accused of abandoning its pension scheme members by, again, on the left-hand side there, the Right Honourable Frank Field. Now, the battle between these two people was great press fodder. So you've got the bête noire, if you want, of the retail industry, Philip Green, and you had Frank Field attempting to take him to task and to hold him to account for the way that BHS pension scheme members were treated. So clearly not the first defined benefit pension scheme to fail, but this raised the profile of the issues that were facing DB schemes and certainly caught the attention of the wider media and particularly the national press. Now, in the end, Philip Green actually settled for just north of £360 million. It kept the scheme out of the Pension Protection Fund, although members did still, on average, take a 12% cut in the value of their benefits. Now, as a result, we've seen defined benefit pensions in the headlines. We've seen journalist interest ratchet up, and the question people are now asking is, who's next? So we've seen Carillion fall. I think that's worth just stopping on that and thinking. Carillion, a company that was couldn't have been more stable. I think certainly two or 3 years ago, took the majority of government contracts. I don't think anyone would have expected members of that scheme to be facing Pension Protection Fund entry. We've got an issue which we'll come on to in a minute around poor understanding of the guarantees that exist in defined benefit, but also the scheme, the Pension Protection Fund, which exists to protect members in the event of their sponsor failing. We've also got the lure of pension freedoms, and the law of record transfer values, all of those things put together led to, as you see in the top left here, the British steel scandal, which I'm sure many of you have read about, particularly in the trade press, but also in the national press as well. So that's an issue which clearly wasn't just about pension transfers, but was also about the advice that they were given, both seemingly by regulated and unregulated advisors. But clearly the issues around DB transfers aren't going to go away anytime soon. We've also got the Department for Work and Pensions looking at this issue closely in terms of DB funding, and the Work and Pensions Committee under Frank Field are all over this issue as well. Again, in terms of whether or not, why it is that journalists are going to be covering this story, impact, well, there are about 10.5 million members of private sector DB schemes and they've got about £1.5 trillion in assets. So clearly the impact, both in terms of those members and in terms of the wider economy, is huge. Divides opinion. So yes, in terms of DB transfer advice, which is going to be one of the big issues this year. So the FCA has recently reversed its decision to. The FCA used to be of the view that advisors should assume that a DB transfer is against a client's wishes. It then went back on this and said it should be neutral. After the British steel scandal, it went back on this again and said that that advisors again need to assume that it's not in members' best interests. Radical potentially, certainly the DWP working paper is looking at a variety of solutions designed to ensure that companies properly fund their schemes. And new, well, no, I'd say this isn't new in a lot of ways. Clearly, the issue of DB funding, the problems that DB schemes have faced in the face of the economic environment and record low gilt yields over a long period of time, will be nothing new to the people listening to this. But the issues that were raised around BHS and around career and around the safety of pensions will be new to a lot of people in the wider UK, and indeed a lot of people who are members of DB schemes who probably aren't quite sure how they work. So just what questions could clients ask off the back of that? So an obvious one, should I quit my DB scheme? In the vast majority of the cases, the answer would be no. But as I said, given the lack of understanding that people have around the protections of DB, the value of their annual guaranteed income from a DB scheme, and the way that the pension protection fund operates, I think it's fairly likely that a lot of people will go to their advisors and want some reassurance that they're staying within the DB scheme is the right decision, particularly if that's in a sector like is a scheme sponsored by a retail company or a sector that's in particular financial distress. And as I alluded to earlier, what happens if the sponsor goes bust? So always good to have the pension protection fund structure in your back pocket if you have any clients with old or current, if they're looking to have a DB pension entitlement. And will transfer values go down as well? This has been part of the issue driving the increase in transfer activity, not just the fact that the pension freedoms make this make DC potentially more attractive, but the argument put forward by a lot of people that transfer values are at a record level, and if you don't do it now, then those offers won't be there in future. Whenever I've got friends who are in DB schemes, and whenever they've asked me about this, my response has always been that the DB scheme wouldn't be offering you anything that's going to cost them, so they'll be offering you fair value to transfer out, and if that transfer value rises, then that reflects the prevailing economic environment. If that transfer value falls, it also reflects the economic environment. So I always get quite nervous when I see people talking about record levels of transfer values and suggesting that people should move their money out of a guaranteed scheme as a result. So just to quickly summarise, journalists clearly face a wide range of pressures from different sources when they're putting together a story. There are some common drivers that will make a good news story, particularly things that affect lots of people, which is one of the reasons pensions are written about so prolifically. Clients will read and react to these stories. I've always thought that staying on top of the media agenda is absolutely crucial, and there are some advisors and power planners who are very good at doing this and some who are less good. I always, clients will read the stuff that's in the press, so if you have the time and you're able to carve out the time to do it, it's worth at least keeping on top of the front pages and the stuff that's in the PF sections. A lot of the advisor community I found, certainly in my time at Money Marketing, lots are very good at working with the press and lots aren't, and see journalists as potentially something to be wary of and something to not talk to. Some of the advisors I've spoken to who do work with journalists speak incredibly positively, both about the impact it has on their business in terms of inquiries they get, but also the impact on the brand if they're seen as a trusted source of information and independent information. And certainly the journalists I speak to are absolutely desperate for independent people, so financial advisors, power planners, to give their take on a story without having the skew of the vested interest of a pension provider or an investment company or anyone else who's attempting to push a certain agenda. So thanks very much for joining me. If you do have any questions or thoughts or comments that you want to send to me, then my email address is tom.selby, that's SELBY, @ajbell.co.uk, or you can send anything through to one of my colleagues. Thanks very much for joining us today. I hope that was useful. Enjoy the rest of your week, and hopefully speak to you soon.